Okay, our next poster is by Kyrie Schroeder, and her major is pre-clinical counseling, so we're moving away from political science for a moment to counseling and psychology. And her talk is Changes in Sexual Behaviors and Beliefs 8 years later.
So to start, I want to introduce myself. My name is Kyrie. I'm a counseling major, but my favorite class here at Corbin was statistics for the behavioral sciences, so that makes me a rare breed of psychology major because I actually like numbers. So that's why we're here this morning. Before I get into my actual topic, I want to talk to you a little bit about some research I've found that introduces the ideas we're going to talk about today. So first, according to the Centers for Disease and Control Prevention, only 27% of the sexually active population in America is made up of young people, ages 15 to 24. However, this is the age group that accounts for over 50% of the millions of new statistically transmitted infections in the United States each year. The part I want to focus on isn't about the STIs, but rather, when we're talking about people who are sexually active, what do we mean when we say that? Are we talking purely sexual intercourse, or are we talking about other things as well, and other acts of sexual behavior? That led me to this other study, which administered questionnaires to 580 ethnically diverse 9th grade students. And the percentage of those having engaged in oral sex, 19.6, was much greater than vaginal intercourse, 13.5. This same study found that those adolescents viewed oral sex as significantly less risky than any other type. And a final study I looked at was from an abstinence program given to students 7th through 10th grade from 4 different states. Those who were influenced by this program developed a more conservative attitude toward sexual behaviors. But what the study couldn't measure was whether their attitudes actually affected their behaviors. So those are kind of the things we're going to look at this morning. And also, we're approaching a cool point because a lot of things change over a decade, and we have 8 years of this human sexuality data. So I wanted to look and see how it's changed. So we are taking data from Dr. Corey Gilbert's human sexuality class, and that's been collected from 2009 to 2017, and that includes students from both Toccoa Falls, Georgia, as well as here at Corbin in Oregon. This is quantitative data. It describes, and that's exactly what we asked our students to do when they looked at the surveys. They were simply answering questions about themselves and describing their own sexual behaviors. We have a total of 274 students in the overall collected data, but for my study particularly, I wanted to see how it's changed. So I focused on the earliest 2 years, 2009 and 2010, and compared them to the most recent years of data, 2016 to 2017. So those are the subjects of my study. And these are taken from Christian colleges, both Georgia and here. These colleges require students to sign a statement of faith before admittance. So we have a more conservative sample. And I did want to look at how conservative attitudes affected sexual behaviors, so we've got this perfect sample right here. I wanted to take a quick peek into the Corbin Handbook because I was curious, what do we say about sexual activity and what is okay and what is not? And the part I want to point out is where we say, in addition, you should not offend your fellow believers or nullify your testimony by becoming involved in inappropriate activity which can lead to moral impurity. Now, moral impurity is kind of a subjective statement because people can really interpret that however they wish. So, out of curiosity, I did a search in our Corbin Handbook, and I searched for oral sex, just to see if they mention it, and intercourse. Oral sex is not mentioned once at all in our Corbin Handbook, and intercourse is only mentioned once, and it's under the area of sexual harassment. Interesting. So this was my hypothesis. I thought that over the last 8 years, we've become a more liberal student population, and because of that, I thought that we've probably increased in our sexual activity. So that's my hypothesis. Let's get into it. So, there were tons of questions on this study that we could have looked at, and there's so much that we can do with this data. But I focused on 3 questions specifically. The first one was how students described themselves on a scale from very conservative to very liberal. And again, I looked at the earliest 2 years, 2009 and 2010, and I compared it to the most recent 2 years, 2016 and 2017, and this is what I found. Those who have labeled themselves conservative, whether it's very conservative or somewhat, has statistically significantly increased from 52% in the earlier years all the way up to 70% in our most recent years. There's also a statistically significant decrease in those who are labeling themselves liberal. So my hypothesis is already wrong, because I thought we were becoming more liberal, but actually the studies showed that we're labeling ourselves more conservative. Now I had to take a pause right here in my study because I realized there could be an extraneous variable that was affecting my data, and that is location. Because we are looking at data from Georgia in the first 2 years, and then data in Oregon from the last 2 years. So I wanted to know if it was actually a change over time or if it was simply a change in location. And in order to test that, I added 2 more groups. I added 2011 and 12, as well as 2014 and 15. And I added that to the trend to see if we could see what direction the data was going. This is what I found. And there is a general upward movement in those saying conservative and a general downward movement in those saying liberal, which does suggest that this is more a change over time and less a change of location. All right, and the second question I focused on was very straightforward. It asked students, have you had oral sex? Have you given, received, or both? And students were answering. And this is what I found. I want to focus specifically on the section that says both. Students who have both given and received oral sex have statistically significantly increased in the last 8 years. Again, just to make sure it was actually a change over time, I added the middle groups, and if we zoom in on the section about both, it is very much a steady increase over time of those who have participated in oral sex. And the last question I focused on was what students consider a prerequisite for engaging in sexual activity. Do they believe they need to be married, committed for life, simply in love, enjoy their partner, know their name, or know nothing? And I compared the first 2 years to the last 2 years, and this is what I found. There is a significant decrease in students who believe that they need to be committed in order to engage in sexual activity. We went from 88% saying that to only 70% in the last 2 years. On the other hand, those who think they only need to be in love increased from 12% to 24%, and both of those are statistically significant leaps. It is again a shift over time, and if we zoom in especially on this one of who thinks they need to be married in order to engage in sexual activity, we have a very steady decline over the last 8 years. So all of that, those 3 questions can be summarized as this. While students in the last 2 years of data consider themselves more conservative than the earlier 2 years, there is a statistically significant increase in the number of students engaging in oral sex and in the number of students not needing a lifelong commitment in order to engage in sexual behavior. Now, before I go into what I interpreted from this data, I do want to acknowledge some limitations of my study. We are very much impacted by society around us, and as we move into a society where we very much value do what makes you happy, especially in sexual activity, then maybe we're seeing ourselves as more conservative, so that is affecting how we answer the question. Also, when I looked at the study, because I was a human sexuality student, I thought, oh, what is my party affiliation? And so I answered based on that. And the study doesn't actually say, are we talking about party affiliation or sexual attitudes? So that definitely could affect how people actually answer this question. Also, the surveys asked about age, gender, and relationship status, but for my particular study, I only focused on the general numbers. So I would be curious to see how this data breaks down based on gender, age, or relationship status. And then back to that piece from the Corbin Handbook, moral impurity, that is a subjective term. So what students think is okay could differ between student to student. So my study sheds light on a growing discrepancy between students, what they are describing themselves in terms of their personal values and what they're actually doing in terms of their sexual behaviors. So there's so much more we can research and study. 2 years ago, Dani Horn stood in my place and she presented her study from this data about how parents are failing their students. They're not creating a safe environment for their students to learn about sex. Maybe you grew up in a conservative Christian home where you were taught not to have intercourse, but what about the many, many boundaries that lead up to that point? Did you talk about that? Did your school talk about that? I believe that Dani showed the failure of parents to create a comfortable environment for students to talk about these kinds of really hard questions. I believe that my study shows that schools aren't talking about it. Schools have failed. We are talking about intercourse and safe sex, but do we talk about the risks and consequences of oral sexual behavior? I think that churches have failed, because that's a topic you do not hear when you're in church, and students really need to hear these things. I believe that we, as Corbin students, have failed because this data shows that we're cutting corners in our moral impurity. We are claiming oral sex to be okay because it's not intercourse. So we have failed as students. And then I believe Corbin has failed us in addressing these things. The fact that our handbook does not actually talk specifically about oral sex or sexual intercourse, it simply gives a subjective term, that's dangerous for our students. Too many Christians are driven by fear of discomfort. I obviously was not, because I've probably said oral sex more times than you guys have heard in a very long time. But I think that's what we need to do. Too many Christians are driven by fear of discomfort, and that is hurting our moral integrity. So I believe that we need to lean into the uncomfortable and the awkward topics, because that's what it's going to take to reverse the trend of the data I just showed you this morning. I'd like to give a special thanks to Dr. Corey Gilbert and Dr. Sarah Comstock for their partnership in this project, and I am now open for questions. Steve, if you want to talk about it, yes.
So, really, the topic is how sensitive it is. Do you think that all this reporting could have hindered the accuracy of the data?
Absolutely. Yes. We did stress ahead of time that it was an anonymous survey. All the data was anonymous. But I think, especially as Christians, we don't always want to answer honestly. So that absolutely could have affected the data.
So you said something about Danny reporting something about parents not talking about it. Could you explain that a little bit more?
Yes. So Danny Horn was the person in my place 2 years ago, and then last year was Nat Cheney. Her study showed, she was looking at where people gained their sexual knowledge. And she found that students would learn most from their parents if they were comfortable. But parents and students alike were uncomfortable in general. They are uncomfortable. And therefore, more students are learning from their peers or from the internet. So the source of our sexual knowledge is changing.
Did you consider using anything beyond percentages, the calculation of percentages, to evaluate such as significance or relevance?
This is all we did for this particular study. All right, thank you, guys.